So I'll start with this and then I will turn off the camera just to capture this conversation. I'm Dr. Elaine O'Neill. I'm the Executive Director of the Washington Farm Forestry Association. And today we're going to talk about Washington's Small Forest Landowner Carbon Work Group. And I have with me going to help with the moderation is Jeff Gersh from Narrative Lab. And Jeff has been tagged to be our help us with the communications on this project. So if you have any questions or issues, raise your hand. Jeff will be the one that's monitoring that while I'm chatting away here. And I am going to turn off my camera to address bandwidth issues. So let's get rolling. My goal is to spend about 45 minutes just talking about the data and the process and then opening it up for a Q&A. So can you see my screen?
Yes.
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 Okay. And does that look like a full presentation screen there?
Yes.
Perfect. Perfect. And I want to do a little shout out. We have quite a good team on this Small Forest Landowner Carbon Work Group, but a special shout out to John Hendrickson, who is doing serving as project lead and sort of managing all of the interactions and surveys and questions like that, and to Jeff, who's on today, and he handles a lot of our communications work for us. And we're sort of a group effort here. For folks that aren't familiar, the Small Forest Landowner Carbon Work Group was established under Section 21 of the Climate Commitment Act, and that happened in 2021. That is an enormous act, and so we're just one tiny little section of it. And in that, they identified that there were some questions that needed to be answered to support small forest landowners as part of this Climate Commitment Act. And they identified the Washington Farm Forestry Association as the entity that would lead that effort. Really, the legislation is pretty succinct, but legislative language is a little bit arcane. So the questions it really asked is how do you set up and fund a pilot program so that we could group small forest landowners to make them eligible for or able to participate in carbon offset projects. Some questions around policies or policy recommendations needed to support incentive programs. What kind of incentives or recommendations are needed to increase carbon storage? And then they threw a little bit of a kicker in is how do we work in the requirements of a prior law that regarded that anything around carbon consider the forest sector as a whole, both harvest, the growth, the management, the harvest of forests, and the use of harvested wood products, which is a little bit unique in the country. I think there's only one other entity that's deliberately trying to integrate this, and that's Georgia. And we actually have somebody who's helping on this project that is also helping on Georgia. So I want to think of this as the outline or the context, the why, the what, and the how. Why carbon in forests? And this is pretty straightforward, I think, for all of the professionals on this call. But I also want to try to provide data. Really, I'm trying to provide sort of a bucket of data for folks to be able to answer questions that they're going to come up against when they're talking with small forest landowners. So I think most people have seen this particular chart, and it really talks about the increasing carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere, and it's sort of a upward spiral, particularly since the 60s, where you see this huge increase in fossil fuel use, and the corollary is the increase in CO2 emissions in the atmosphere. I specifically like that NOAA chart because it reminds us, those little jiggles remind me that every year when the northern hemisphere, I'm going to say, breathes in, when
Good.
leaf out happens, CO2 emissions go down, and then at leaf fall, they go up. And so that jagged pattern really is a year over year change. So we know that we have this increase in CO2 in the atmosphere, and there's concern that it's driving climate change. And we know that there are these two-way flows, both from between the atmosphere and the land, between atmosphere and vegetation, and that forests are particularly good at pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and also the oceans. But fossil fuels is really a one-way flow to the atmosphere. Um, that one-way flow has to be taken up by other sinks. And we know, we've all been trained in biology, and I think most people probably got this in eighth grade biology, that there's this chemical equation for it. Carbon dioxide but plus water gives you a carbohydrate, and that carbohydrate is in our case it's wood. Wood happens to be 400 to 1 carbon to nitrogen, so it turns out to be a really really efficient scrubber of CO2 out of the atmosphere, and its co-benefits are to produce water and oxygen for the rest of us to breathe. Now, the other thing that is discussed in things like the IPCC, but is sometimes hard for people to wrap their head around, is the idea that, well, wood stores carbon dioxide as carbon because it's 50% carbon, or as trees do that, so does wood. When you harvest a tree, it doesn't all just immediately evaporate into the atmosphere as an emission, even though there are some accounting processes that suggest that that's true so that they avoid double counting. Um, by the way, that is one of the reasons why there are laws like there are in this state, which define biomass as carbon neutral, because it's already been accounted for in the land account in these broader accounting processes. It's a little bit complicated. I'm not going to get into it today because I don't think that that necessarily is a talking point that you're going to want to have with small forest landowners. It's not necessarily germane to where they are in the process. And of course, when we think about this, and this comes back to the little kicker that was added into that section 21 when it referenced a bunch of other documents, is that there's this flow of carbon. There is a carbon cycle, and we're interested in what happens in the forest, growing forest to remove carbon from the atmosphere. But we also have to think about what happens in the forest if there's wildfire or insects or disease or disturbance. And then what happens if we harvest, and how can we do a better job of moving that carbon out of the atmosphere and into products where it's going to stay a long time. So that's carbon and forests. And then I think the other thing that's really helpful to small landowners is to answer the question, why should they care and why are they relevant? So I've aggregated a bunch of data here. This particular chart is all national data, where we look at the allocation of forest land between owner categories. And it turns out that nearly half of U.S. timberland, so this is land that's capable of growing trees, but isn't otherwise locked up in some sort of a reserve like a park or something like that. So it's capable of growing trees and being harvested. Nearly half of it is in non-corporate landowners, and interestingly enough, um, almost 40% of it is actually in family forest ownership. So nationally, we're kind of a big deal. The family forest landowners own more timberland and more forest land than any other group nationally, including the federal government. Now, in Washington State, if we bring that down, the components are a little bit different, where the non-corporate own about a quarter of all timberland in Washington State. So that's based on federal statistics. And then when we go down to the state level analysis, family forest landowners own about 15% of forest acres in Washington State, which is 2.9 million acres. That's not inconsequential. we're kind of a big deal writ large, even though individually it can feel like what I do on my little parcel doesn't make that much difference. The small forest landowners are the uh, basically situated closer to the main travel corridors and thoroughfares, closer to the infrastructure and also closer to the cities, so they're more at risk in a number of different ways. They're the dark brown on this this map on the left, and you'll see there's a huge concentration of small forest landowners in Stevens, Ponderay, and Spokane County, and down there in Southwest Washington. I think that it's important to let small forest landowners know that the legislature thinks that they're important, and they're willing to put some energy into solving some of the issues that come up for small forest landowners. Most people don't really realize that we even have our own statute based on the Forest and Fish Law in 1999. There's a big law around the regulations, and there's another different separate law, the RCW 7613, that's specifically for small forest landowners. And then in 2019, we were able to get some funding, advocate for some funding. This is WFFA was able to advocate for some funding to get a broader understanding of the small forest landowners in the state, look at status and trends and recommendations. And that is the document on your in your viewer right now. And there's a link to that. It's 430 pages. Uh, Enormous amount of information in there. And I'm just going to hit a couple of highlights that I think are useful takeaways as you're talking with small forest landowners. Uh, the first, and I think probably anybody who works with them knows this, is that there's a huge variability in the reasons for owning forest land that small forest landowners have. And this is based on a sample of about 2,500, I think, and they got a pretty good return on that survey. They did 3 or 4 surveys as part of this research work, and you'll find that there's a lot of different reasons, but there's also multiple reasons within each family or each landowner individually. So that's important to know when you're trying to develop policy. The other thing that I thought was really interesting, because the policies around carbon are really around carbon markets and carbon incentives, is that there's a huge variability in financial goals across owners. And depending on the number of acres they own, there's a huge variability in the number of acres owned. I think there's 218,000 small forest landowners, plus or minus. Um, and that's counting from 2 acres up to more than 1,000 acres. Obviously, the larger the landowner, the more likely they are to have to deem having some level of income or investment as part of an ownership objective. But I'm kind of amazed at how many really small landowners consider their forest land as part of an investment portfolio, something they want to pass on to their children, um, for example. And then on this chart, you have the gray dots are west side owners and the black dots are east side owners that were in this survey. And you start to see that even you would think there might be a split east to west, and that's not really all that obvious. Another thing to put in your sort of quiver of information as you're talking to folks is, we like to think if you're larger, you have this financial goals and objectives, and if you're smaller, you don't, but that's not necessarily true. The other thing that I thought was really fascinating in this document, and I've pulled the page numbers for you to make that easier, and I'm going to make this available, this slide deck available afterwards for people to look at and reference, is that when the surveyors asked what would help small landowners deal with economic losses due to regulation, and obviously they gave a list of items. Payments for carbon was the number one often cited answer, which says there's a huge interest in understanding how to get paid for this ecosystem service, or how to, find the value in this ecosystem service and have it come back to the landowner. So then I think the question of why Washington State, besides the obvious, well, they passed the Climate Commitment Act here, I think there's a bigger, deeper understanding that it's helpful for people to think about in terms of the context of Washington State. What's really has been fascinating for me, I've been in the state for about 20 years now, a little over 20 years, and I've been in this position for more than 10. And to realize that the history of logging and clearing of land and conversion of land started in the 1800s. And it was kind of like they moved from the East Coast to the West Coast, and they got to the West Coast and said, okay, now we better figure out how to uh, move from exploitation into management, into farming. And so the very first certified tree farm in the US actually happened in Montesano, Washington in 1941. I mean, that's 6 months before Pearl Harbor was bombed. That's a long time ago. And so it was the prescience of that particular, at that point, family company, who's now, the biggest company in the world, I think, or maybe the second biggest, that established this idea of tree farming. And from them came the efforts that were largely driven by then whatever DNR was called at that time, that were trying to help small forest landowners figure out how to do this, which was really the genesis of the Washington Farm Forestry Association. We were uh, established in 1953, so we're 70 years old this year. The other thing that I found fascinating is a there are many multi-generational tree farming families in this state. Some of them have been here since before statehood. And this particular example that I'm showing here was our tour site last year, or last month, I guess, for our annual meeting, demonstrating the deep generational ties to the land and commitment to sustainability that these small forest landowners have. This is an 18-acre old growth park that their forefathers had logged in the 1800s, and now it's 140 years old. Here's another example. This particular gentleman is almost on the Canadian border. They've been on that forest land since before statehood, and I think this picture's about a decade old, so probably 60 years it's been certified. Long-term commitment, multi-generational. And then because of that, they like to try unique and different things. This is on the first property where they've tried redwood, and it's just, I mean, it's pretty stunning example of um, the effort that goes into keeping a forest land, keeping forest land forested, and looking at and trying different things. I heard, I think it was a commentary from my old professor that some of you may know, Chad Oliver, recently retired from Yale, talk about that the most unique things that he had seen in his long career all over the world emerged on small forest landowners, because they had this ability to try different things. Number one, they had the freedom to do it because they weren't responsible to shareholders except their family, but they also perhaps were innovators because they didn't necessarily have the money to do the way it was at that point in time. The other thing that's interesting about uh, Washington is we really love our forests. So we have more than half of them are actually off base from harvesting. So that's the restricted forest. 53% of our forest land is actually reserved from harvest for any number of reasons. And I think that that's important context when people are worrying about long-term sustainability. Um, and I think that this was the other point that I wanted to make here, is that 53% doesn't necessarily uh, include all of the legacies, the family legacies that I see on almost every single forest landowner that I've been on their property always has something that's special to the family, and it's just there for as long as they own the property. And I think that that's a really remarkable conversation to have with small forest landowners if they're recently acquired it, is to think about that legacy for their family for the future if they intend to maintain the land in the family. The other thing that's interesting about the PNW and Washington specifically is we actually carry the largest standing inventory on the smallest acreage. When you look at regional acreages in the U.S., we're a little over 50 million between the Pacific in the Pacific Northwest between Washington and Oregon, but we have over 300, no, over 140 billion cubic feet of growing stock, and that really hasn't changed in 70 years. So that's telling us that we must be doing something right, and it's highly, highly productive. And so those become part of this larger story of the importance of keeping forest land forested in this state. When we parse that out, it's always been the case, well, at least for the last 70 years, that your private forest land, so your small private, large private, has always carried a little bit less, about 9,000 board feet per acre on average, than the public. So that's your DNR and your Forest Service land. Um, and the DNR Forest Service land hasn't really reduced the number of acres, but we've probably lost, excuse me, about 1 million acres in private going stock over the last 70 years. It's just been converted to other uses. Of course, there's challenges to this sustainability. Wildfires. We know that DNR's got the 20-year forest health plan to address these kinds of things. Uh, it was a big shocker in 2015 when 1 million acres burned in Washington. That was the first year over 10 million acres burned nationwide, and now we have places like Alberta, Canada, for whatever reason, loses 1 million acres in May, or I think they might even be up to 2 million acres. Um, that is not necessarily a only or solely a national forest issue, but it's most obvious in the national forest timberland inventory, where you see this massive spike in mortality and hence a net decline in net growth. So, this idea that if we reserve these forests and we can use and appreciate them forever, and then we have to deal with this huge risk of mortality, insects, disease, and wildfire. The other risk we have in Washington state, and this is more germane to small forest landowners, and it's more germane to Western not Washington, but not exclusively, is there's been a huge interest in conversion of forest land from forest land into development, concentrated development, or just individual parcels that then get cleared. And that turns out to be a fairly significant risk in certain areas. This is back to that UW report that was commissioned in 2019 and published in January 2021. You look at that heat map, and the areas around Vancouver and the Snohomish King area have a very high probability of being converted. They're estimating about 9% of those acres will be converted out of forest land by 2030, an additional 9%. So, taking those pieces, so those are a bunch of different data points that we pulled, and this is another report that looked at similar data in a different way, and this is done by Indranil Ganguly and colleagues at the University of Washington. They published this spring, and it looks at this idea. So the stuff I've just shown you is all about stocks, what's standing in the forest. And this is talking about what they call flux, what's being pulled out of the atmosphere and where is it going. I find when I talk to landowners, they have a hard time with those words because they're trying to understand the words as well as what you're talking to them about. So we're trying this approach of let's put it in economic terms because almost everyone understands gross income, expenses, net income, and profit. So Dr. Ganguly and his grad students looked at this data, looked at change over time, and was able to parse that out by owner groups. And here I pulled that data from his report and put it in this nice little table and talk about sequestration, the amount that's sucked out of the atmosphere every year per acre, the expenses associated with that. So that's losses from mortality, decay, landfill. And we included manufacturing because we were tracking all the way to the wood product. And then you subtract that, that gives you your net income. And then we did a few calculations on it. What was pretty clear from that analysis is that the industry group probably does the best job of sucking carbon out of the atmosphere, and the small forest landowners do the best job of reducing losses and increasing the long-term asset in terms of standing timber. But they frankly do a really bad job, or let's just say there's a lot of opportunity for improvement in terms of the sequestration per acre. And this is a good uh, point to remember when we're talking about carbon incentives. So when we think about those numbers and we think about the landscape, it's easy to see how, in this case on the left, that's a Port Blakely. Well, he's now the CEO of Port Blakely. He was a forester at that point in time. How that management emphasis that's moving into harvested wood products is going to generate a lot more uh, carbon being sucked out of the atmosphere versus a no management alternative, which is on the right on small forest landowner property. And that when you add that harvested wood product into this long-term stock picture, you start to see that you're adding about 3,000 board feet per acre that is added into the stored out of the atmosphere category for small or for sort of the private harvesters, most of which is industry. I want to go back to this again to highlight that small forest landowner line, which is the fourth one down, and talk about it because the first time I saw it, I was sort of chastising Dr. Ganguly. What about the smalls? This doesn't look right. But that's because I have small forest landowners that are doing a really great job at sequestering. But I think that this number hides a lot of variability. So here's an example. Again, let nature take its course, a 50-year-old stand and a managed 50-year-old stand. Both of these are small forest landowners, both of them in the South Sound, sort of Lewis County region. You can see that there's difference, and I'd say probably the inventory is about 4 times the volume on that managed stand versus the unmanaged stand at 50 years of age. So that's your background. What is the carbon work group doing? So we have this enormous data dump that we're trying to synthesize and put into some sort of a order to make recommendations on this idea of carbon, which is when you think about wood volume and carbon, it's about 50% carbon by dry weight. So there's a correlation there. When we first learned that we had this section that we had to do something about, started to think about the framing, and you get this pretty complex flow diagram. We're going to go through those pieces, but think of the big gray box is all the inputs that we're going to need. The yellow box is the deliberations of the work group, and then the work group output box is that teal, which is really the recommendations and how you would actually implement them in the state. When we think about inputs, there was some scientific answers that needed to needed to happen. That's the stuff at the bottom where we're looking at a forced carbon inventory to try to minimize transaction costs. That was a really important thing. That went over to the University of Washington because they'd already developed a fairly robust landscape carbon measurement model. And we're actually going to hear about where they are in that process here next week in our work group. And then because of the additional requirement to think of the forest sector, we brought in a harvested wood products assessment. Those are the two, we call them science pieces that are down there at the bottom. We also recognize because there was so much variability in landowner need and landowner interest and landowner goals and objectives that we better do a fairly robust job of doing surveying them, providing opportunities for input, and then because we have a lot of other interested parties providing opportunities for stakeholder outreach. So there's a huge effort to gather information. And that leads to I think the thing that we really need people that are interacting with small landowners to do is to let them know about it and let them know that there are these opportunities to do things. Maybe not serve on the work group at this moment because we're halfway through the process, but certainly filling out a survey, signing up for a focus group to providing data. Or one of the things that we think is really important as a work group is to come up with some ideas and take them out. I'm going to call it beta test. Go back to a larger group and say, these are the kinds of things that we're thinking about, and getting that immediate feedback from those small forest landowners that would have a stake in this goal, in this process. Um, Take all of that information, synthesize it, tie it back into, some of these market processes, tie it back into other information that's coming from other jurisdictions. And with that, try to develop recommendations that don't just sit on a shelf, but actually can be implemented in the state. That's our big goal. It's pretty ambitious to accomplish in 18 months, but we're giving it a good go. Um, our members looked at that and said, that's too messy. Let's find a simpler way. So we tried this one. Because when you think about what we're trying to do, if we're trying to mitigate CO2 emissions, that's um, oh, I don't have a cursor that can point to that. That's essentially the outcome we're looking for. All of these policies, how we tweak them to get to that goal is is what the essence of this work is. And so we broke it into two buckets. There's a market policy, a carbon market policy, where we want functional forest and harvested wood product carbon markets. And then there's an incentive policy where you want functional forest and harvested wood product carbon incentives. And each one of them needs different elements to be considered, but there's only a few levers. And then each one of those levers has a few levers. So we're building that out. We're building out these a decision matrix that really helps us understand what needs to be in place for these to work. Um, one of the first things that we did was have a rundown on carbon markets and forest offset protocols. We learned about the California Forest Offset Protocol. We learned about the Family Forest Carbon Program, and we learned about the Washington Forest Offset Protocol. And we're going to talk a little bit about the outcomes from California because it's been in process longer, and just say that the Washington uh, protocol is essentially driven. Um, it's it's not exactly a copy paste, but a lot of the elements were taken from the California market, so we can expect similar kinds of outcomes. You could do a whole talk just on carbon markets. In fact, you could probably do 5 hours on it. It's really complicated. Think of it as you have a program, it's going to develop what's acceptable, what isn't acceptable. It's going to develop the standards. But programs that are organizing this, they need a third party verification to prove that you're doing what it is that they say you're going to do. And then there's this rule book. That's the forest offset protocol. And that's rule book. It varies by program. Already, you're going to lose people on this. Um, but if there's anything that you can get through to them this idea that there's four elements in all of these programs. Because with markets, what you're doing is saying, I'm going to do something on my forest or my forest plus harvested wood products that is beneficial to the atmosphere in exchange for somebody else emitting to the atmosphere. So there's this thing called a baseline. It has to be additional to what you're already doing. You're going to have to address leakage and it's going to be permanent. And in most cases, those elements become impediments or barriers for small forest landowner participation. It's California, for example. You can get paid for 25 years, but then you have to maintain carbon stocks for 100 years after that. That's like a 99-year lease on your house. It's essentially selling the rights for you to do almost anything uh, in that forest outside of the prescriptions offered by the offset protocol. Really, really complex to get into. A lot of inventory requirements, a lot of re-verification requirements, and you're not allowed to change the boundaries for 100 years. One of the things that we're trying to solve in the work we're doing is this inventory piece, figuring out how to do it with remote sensing, um, so that we can reduce those costs and figure out how to do aggregation, which is something that is being piloted on the East Coast. There were some other offset protocol requirements in California that were sort of eliminating family forest landowners from participating, and these were just some that were identified in that presentation. So what we came up with at that point was this doesn't look really, really promising. We're going to go through a process to understand aggregation, but we really want to focus on incentive policies. We know that there's lots of opportunities to improve sequestration via improved forest management. The data are telling us that. The data say that in the information I just showed you from Dr. Ganguly. So we have underperforming assets. Um, and so the other thing that we think is helpful in the data that's come our way is that there's this conversation out there about, well, if I have this old growth stores, then I can get credit for it. Well, maybe you can and maybe you can't because it has to be additional. Um, Versus this current growth, this flux story. This is evolving. I'm going to say it's a little bit the Wild West out there at the moment. There's lots of opportunities, but remind people to read the fine print because it is a long-term contract. And we're hoping to tie back into that harvested wood product piece. Um, this is some fun work I presented at WSU Extension to the forest landowners directly about getting them to help them understand what they could do for improving management. And I was advocating for everybody having an increment borer because even in a low density Doug fir stand, so that's actually out of my wood pile. I did a harvest a couple of years ago. I was sort of surprised at how quickly the growth declined um, on a 30-year-old tree. This is a 30-year-old Douglas fir. And then, of course, there's an example down below. It was in Eastern Washington recently, looking at how the impacts of competition and management and non-management influence growth and therefore the vigor and the health of trees. This, I think, is a really interesting story for landowners. They're interested in figuring out how to maintain the health of their forest and the vigor of their forest and being able to walk them through or show them how to do that is a powerful tool for them to start thinking about how would they do it, or first getting them on board to, yeah, maybe you're going to have to do something to maintain growth, which maintains carbon sequestration, and also think about forest health because there is a correlation there between them. And then something that we're struggling with a little bit, but I think everybody is how do you incorporate fire resilience into this idea of sequestering carbon on the landscape? Because the more carbon you have in the landscape when you have a wildfire, the more catastrophic the outcome. Uh, just a list of various resources on forest and wood carbon that are specific to Washington State. There's zillions of them out there, but these ones were specific to Washington State. Um, and that's about all I had for you. I don't know how quickly I went through that, um, but oh, just about right on time. So I'm going to open to questions now. Are there any questions?
Elaine, just for, the kind of purpose of this, getting it out to the foresters that work with the landowners as far